Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with how to build a really basic classical music collection, library, whatever you want to call it, to get all the necessary recordings you need to prove yourself a supremely cultured, erudite. Oh, never mind. We don't care about that. It's just finding all the music that you like. And that you really ought to hear if you're curious about what classical music is and why it matters and what all the hoo-ha is about. And boy, is this a hoo-ha one, because we're talking about Bach's Goldberg variations, one of the great hoo-has in the history of music. It is the largest set of keyboard variations ever written. Probably. Well, I mean, crazy people have done more, but it's the largest set that anybody cares about. With all of it, the repeats performed, which sometimes you get and sometimes you don't, it's going to last well more than an hour, 70 minutes, 75 minutes, depending on who's playing it. It could be hours and hours and hours if certain keyboardists are doing it. But it is an absolutely amazing piece. It consists of an aria, an opening theme, plus 30 variations thereupon, after which the theme returns exactly as we first heard it. There's something amazing about the structure of it because, well, the aria is not the subject, that is, the tune of the aria is not the subject of the variations. The variations are all variations on the bass line of the aria. That's something to keep in mind. The left hand, not the tune, the thing on the bottom. And so you don't really need to pay any attention to the theme at all when you listen to the variations. Each one is its own little, sort of character vignette, but they're all related. They're related by this common bass line, which Bach is varying all along. That's what makes it so ingenious, and that's what keeps it from becoming a total snooze fest. Because you've got to, if something that's going to be longer than an hour, you have to range fairly far afield from your original idea. There are many ways to do that. I mean, Beethoven does it in an entirely different way in his Diabelli variations, which is the second largest set of keyboard variations ever written that anyone cares about. But it's a remarkable work in the way that it's structured. And after hearing this whole exordium of 30 character pieces, the return of that simple aria at the end, it's slow, it's poetic, it's soulful. I mean, there's something about it that gives an almost cosmic feeling of completeness, of the world has been created and that's it. I mean, that's characteristic of, late Bach. Generally, it was published, I think it was about 1741, somewhere in there. And in his last works, Bach died in 1750, he basically summarized all of music as he knew it, one work after another. The B minor Mass was everything you could do with choral music. The Art of Fugue was everything you could do with a fugue. The Goldberg variations are everything you could do with variation form. I mean, he had this compendiousness about him, and he had the ability to do it. I mean, it's one thing if you decide you're going to summarize all of music as I know it, and you're a clod, and you don't know what you're doing, and you just write, reams of goop. Bach had no goop at all whatsoever. I mean, he was totally, just a screaming genius. And so he could do these sorts of things. And the Goldberg variations is just perfect. And it's kind of amazing how it's become such an iconic work only rather recently. It was Glenn Gould in his first recording with no repeats for Columbia in mono in like the 1950s that brought the work back into the international mainstream. And since then, it's just been flying along. I mean, it's Hannibal Lecter's favorite piece of music. I mean, if that's not a recommendation, I don't know what is. Really, really exceptional. Now, the thing you need to know about the Goldberg variations, there are two things. Talking about the work itself. So you know that the variations are not going to be based on the actual tune, but rather a bass line, which you may or may not notice or pay attention to. The more you listen to it, the more familiar you'll get with the patterns of harmonies that this bass line outlines. And so you may hear it more in the variations. But that doesn't matter so much. Every third variation is a canon. You know what a canon is? A canon is a round, like row your boat. where one person starts and then a couple bars later or a bar later, someone else comes in and it does that. A canon is basically around. In this case, they're in two parts because you have two hands. And so you can play, and there's a bass line. You really need three hands to play the Goldberg variations, but, we don't go into that. They do it, and how they do it is one of the great mysteries of keyboard performance. But in any case, the canons begin at the unison. That is, it's the same tune as in Row Your Boat. That's a canon at the unison. And then they start rising by step. So there's at the second, that is the answering voice comes in one step higher. So if you begin on the note C, the answering voice would come in on the note D. And then in every third variation, this happens, and they rise by step. So you've got a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, eighth, ninth, an octave, a ninth, because by then you're up to variation 27. Get it? 3 times 9 is 27. And that's how Bach does it. And these canons are amazing because the fact that the answers come in at different intervals means that the harmonies will change. The harmonies will go from very dissonant. If you play a C and a D together, you get like bang. It's not a pleasant consonant sound. But if you get a third, it's like da, da, da. It's nice. You get nice harmonies. You get strange harmonies. So the canons force Bach to keep things interesting. And while we listen to one voice following the other, we are in turn transfixed. The things that are not canons could be absolutely anything. Sometimes they're duets between the two hands. Sometimes they're brilliant, what they call toccata or touch piece type things with like keyboard figurations flying all over the place. The second half of the work, variation, 15 or 16? It's one of those, doesn't matter. Begins with an overture, a French overture, as they call it in the day. There's all kinds of character that Bach stuffs into this work. The very last variation is a quodlibet. Quodlibet means as you please. It's a collection of folk tunes, such as were sung by Bach around his jolly dinner table with his dozens of children and other friends and people. Really, really an astonishing masterpiece. And it's big, and you need to take your time over it. Now, the other thing we need to talk about when we deal with the Goldberg variations, well, there are a couple things. There's a little bit of mythos. Like, no one's quite sure why it's called the Goldberg variations, because it was written for, supposedly, we're not sure this is entirely true. It was supposedly written for a guy named Count Kaiserling who had insomnia. And so the story is that Bach wrote it to keep him entertained when he couldn't sleep, not to help him fall asleep, but to keep him alert while he was up. Now, I think that's complete hogwash. I really do. He may have commissioned it. I don't know, whatever the reason was. But Bach's writing of this piece it's one of those didactic, comprehensive, summarize the universe pieces. And, I get the sense that somehow Bach would have wanted to show off what he could do in the variation form, irrespective of whether the Count had insomnia. The other issue is that Goldberg, who was supposed to play it, who was supposedly a very, very talented keyboard artist, was only 14 when the work was published. Now, that doesn't stop anything because they had all kinds of horrible child labor going on back then. And of course, Mozart and his sister were circus freaks when they were young, performing when they were like 3. And, there were little, kids were exploited ruthlessly back in the day. Remember that every time people went to church on Sunday, there was some poor orphan, urchin standing in the back pumping the bellows of Bach's organ by hand to keep the air pressure up. And they had to do that as long as the organ was playing. And, people don't talk about that so much. It's really kind of horrible. What people were doing is they were innocently worshiping our great creator while torturing small children to play their organ. So, yeah, there was a lot going on back then. I tend to think that Bach had his own reasons for writing the piece. We don't really know all of what they were. But the other thing that you need to know when you listen to the Goldberg variations, that it was originally written for harpsichord. And it was written for harpsichord with 2 manuals, minimally. 2 manuals meaning 2 keyboards, because harpsichords have problems playing loud and soft. because they're quills that pluck strings. And when you push the key, it either plucks or it doesn't. Pushing it harder doesn't make it pluck any harder because it only takes a certain amount of force to pluck the string. So you're not going to get like more if you hit it harder. You're just going to pluck, it goes twang. So in order to make harpsichords louder, they had multiple racks of strings played by different keyboards. Now, those keyboards could be coupled together mechanically. So you had twice as much strings, twice as much sound. Get it? You could do that. But also, it allowed for a certain independence of line in the way that the instrument was constructed, because you had one hand up here and one hand down here, and they're all going like this simultaneously. It makes crossing hands very easy, because on a piano, everyone's on the same keyboard. You can interfere, get your fingers all in a knot. So Bach could do all kinds of things with multiple keyboards. And some harpsichords had different registers. They had lute registers. They had all, as many strings as you could stuff into it that had different sound. That's what you could do. And you could attach them and detach them with, knobs and, things like that. So he wrote it for the harpsichord. No question about it. It became famous in our current civilization on the piano. And it's perfectly playable on the piano. Difficult, but Bach is always difficult. Bach is notoriously difficult. So yes, you can play it perfectly well on the piano. And the question is, which do you prefer? Now, personally, you'll see, and people get ferociously passionate about this. They really do. I love it on the harpsichord, and I love it on the piano. I would rather hear a great performance on a harpsichord than a boring performance on the piano, and vice versa. The problem with versions on the harpsichord, and this is really an issue, is that lots of harpsichords sound just terrible. The sound of the harpsichord is something people either love or don't. And my feeling is that people develop their passions about this thing without having really listened to the range of available harpsichords. I mean, it's so many performers, especially those who are interested in authentic performance, are more interested in finding a keyboard instrument that resembles something that Bach may have used than one that sounds good. Pianos have a certain homogeneity of tone. I mean, different makes of pianos sound different. Different instruments can sound different from the same maker. But there is a basic piano sonority that we all kind of are used to, we all kind of like. Harpsichords were supplanted by the piano because of their obvious issues with, for example, dynamic range and expressivity. And so performers today either totally ignore the issue of timbre, which is a mistake, because there are harpsichords out there that sound gorgeous, beautiful, pearlescent tones. I mean, they really are. And there are harpsichordists who care about the sound of their instrument and who are very, very discerning in choosing instruments that you can listen to for an hour and 10 minutes and not want to run away screaming. The conductor, Sir Thomas Beecham, famously said that the tone of the harpsichord reminded him of two skeletons copulating on a tin roof, which is a fabulous line. People attribute that, by the way, to hundreds of other artists as well, but it's out there in the classical music world. My information is that it came from Thomas Beecham, who was a notorious wit. But in any case, if you don't like the sound of the harpsichord, fine, listen to it on the piano. If you want to hear it the way Bach wrote it, listen to it on the harpsichord. Try both. See how different it sounds. Listen to the differences in terms of clarity and expressivity, and how certain variations will come across perhaps with more directness and intensity, and others less, depending on which instrument plays it. That's what makes it so interesting. And you don't have to listen to all 30 variations at once. You really don't. I mean, Bach wrote them as individual little works. I think the thing is magnificent when you hear it all, but you have to really be in the mood to hear it all. I mean, you have to be ready to pay attention. I mean, Hannibal Lecter had no problem. He was sitting in a birdcage in the middle of something, and they gave him a stereo, and he played the Goldberg variations. He had nothing better to do with his time except plotting how to kill his jailers and eat somebody or whatever. But most of us who are rather busy are not going to have an hour or almost an hour or something like that to listen to this thing regularly. And if you hear it and it just grabs you and you can do it, then more power to you. But if you don't, play it, start it and wait to see what grabs your attention. See what happens. I mean, it's not likely to have individual tracks. Well, CDs will. CDs will have individual tracks. You can go from variation to variation, but listen to it in bunches. Or just listen to the canons, listen to every third variation so you get a feel for that. There are many ways to get to know it, and they're fun. Well, I'm not talking about something that's like an academic exercise where you're going to get tested afterwards. I mean, you can listen to all of the canons and listen to all of, the intermediate variations and all of those other things, however you like, in whatever order you like. And then eventually, once you get to know it really, really well, and if you feel that's the way you want to approach it, then you can do the whole thing. There's no one way. And that's really why I want my message to you about this piece. Just like I said with symphonies, listen to the parts that you like first and gradually work into the others. You can see how it all fits together. Well, this is a mega example of that. None of the variations are terribly long. I mean, the longest is, I think, variation 25 it is. It's as slow. It's adagio. It could be like 8 minutes with all the repeats. But all the others, anywhere from a minute and a bit to 3 minutes, they're short. So you can play them however you want and dip into it whenever you want and see what you enjoy. That's how I did it. I mean, quite honestly, and it was harder in those days because there were LPs and you didn't have individual tracks. It was just like the first 15 and you turned the thing over and you got the next 15. And some of the performances were so long that they were on 3 record sides. So that was, a whole different thing. And there's such a huge range of interpretation in the work, so many possibilities for listening. I mean, you could literally spend like half a lifetime just playing around with the Goldberg variations, and you'll have to decide how much time you have to spend on it. It's worth it. I can tell you that right away. I mean, Bach is content plus. As much time as you get, you will be rewarded accordingly. So give it a shot and have a great time with it. Just have fun with it. Don't worry that it's like Bach, Bach. Oh my God, it's Bach. Don't worry about any of that stuff. It's there for your pleasure. And do it in the way that gives you the maximum amount of enjoyment. And you'll be doing exactly what Bach intended. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.